Good evening to our panelists and our community members joining us here, and all of those that are joining us via our live stream for our Community Connections evening featuring a mental health panel with community experts. My name is Megan Dennis, and I am the Director of Pupil Services at Downingtown Area School District. I'm joined today with my co-moderator, Sarah Brooks, who is our Student Assistance Specialist. We are joined this evening by 4 professionals who have generously donated their time to speak on the topics of mental health, wellness, suicide prevention, and substance abuse. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to thank all of you who submitted questions in advance. We also provided note cards at the door for additional questions that we will ask at the end of the presentation if time allows. Additionally, this event is being recorded and will remain accessible on our district website and our DASD Pupil Services YouTube page. To start our introductions, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Matthew Wintersteen. Dr. Wintersteen is an associate professor and director of research in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. His grant-funded work supports his role as facilitator of the Pennsylvania Higher Education Suicide Prevention Coalition, which is a collaborative partnership among nearly 100 campuses across Pennsylvania and beyond, designed to support one another in developing meaningful and effective methods of reducing suicide deaths on campus. Dr. Wintersteen was also awarded a grant from Vibrant to expand Pennsylvania's coverage of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Additionally, he recently was awarded the federal funding to examine the effectiveness of a comprehensive aftercare program for suicide attempters, as well as support statewide efforts to improve continuity of care for individuals of all ages affected by suicide. He has served on national and international task force convened by the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, the American Association of Suicidology, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Suicide Awareness and Voices of Education, and the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Wintersteen was a consultant to the National Center for the Prevention of Youth Suicide, serves on Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf's Suicide Prevention Task Force, and is on the executive board to Prevent Suicide PA, and after spending nearly a decade as the co-chair of the Pennsylvania Youth Suicide Prevention Initiative.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? We're also joined by Amanda Blue, who is the Outreach Manager for the College of Health Sciences at Westchester University and serves as the chair of the Chester County Suicide Prevention Task Force. After experiencing the loss of her husband to suicide in 2008, she became an active participant on the Westchester Mental Health Awareness Committee, organizing events, walks, and presentations for the campus. Following the loss of her husband by just 4 years, Amanda lost her 14-year-old son to suicide. With increasing passion and commitment, Amanda has worked in suicide prevention through speaking, advocacy, and education. She has been an advisor to the Student Active Minds chapter and created a campus-wide program called Take a Mental Health Day. This was the first all-campus mental health event providing an opportunity for the campus community to engage in an interactive presentations regarding mental health and has become an annual event at Westchester University. She is a certified youth and adult mental health first aid instructor and program administrator for the Chester County PA. She's also a certified QPR, question, persuade, refer trainer. Amanda completed her master's degree in public health with the intention to continue her work in awareness and education surrounding the public health crisis that suicide has become.
We also have the pleasure of welcoming Michael Blanche. Michael Blanche is a licensed clinical social worker that has over 25 years of experience providing direct clinical treatment for those who are dually diagnosed with addiction and other psychological issues. Michael has worked in all levels of care in the treatment of addiction and mental health. Michael is a leading expert in the field of prevention. Michael specializes in middle school and high school prevention talks and staff development. Michael is known for working with complex individuals and their families, assisting in difficult times of discerning the appropriate level of care and proper placement. He co-founded Ethos Treatment 3 years ago and acts as their chief clinical officer with 3 locations in the Philadelphia area, and providing assessments, outpatient, and intensive outpatient clinical services for adolescents and adults with substance abuse and mental health issues.
Sue Lombardi is a licensed social worker and supervises the clinical treatment programs throughout the Chester County Intermediate Unit. Starting her career with Chester County Youth and Family Services, Sue has dedicated her career to the support of students and families in need of mental health and/or substance abuse treatment. She can speak to school-based prevention, intervention, and treatment that the IU currently offers, as well as overseeing the Chester County Crisis Response Team, which actively mobilizes following the death of either a student or staff. We want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions to our community, both in the past, this past spring, and this evening. To start, we're going to begin with some questions related to general health and wellness. Meg?
Thank you. Question 1 is directed to Ms. Amanda Blue. Can you speak to how we build resilience in our youth so they can handle feelings of rejection, loss, failure, and disappointment? Additionally, can we teach our children to be happy with who they are?
That's a really huge question. I think that there are a lot of ways to teach children about resiliency. I don't think there is a single way. I think it begins when children are young. I think it's a difficult task to try to encourage resiliency when kids are 14, 15, and 16. I think that some of the patterns that we establish as parents contribute to that. So there's a lot of information out there about resiliency and teaching resiliency at home as well as in schools. And a lot of it focuses on connection. And it not only connection between parents and children, but connection for children with other peers. So I think we have to sort of foster those things at home. We have to encourage kids to talk. We have to talk to our kids. We have to know how to talk to our kids. And if we're not sure about that, there are lots of resources for learning about that. We have to use language with our kids that inspire those conversations and open those doors to those conversations. I think resiliency is built through kids having good coping skills, and those are things that we model as well as teach to our kids. So those are all factors in resiliency, and they all play a role, and we can continue to build those things. And I know there are lots of parenting programs out there. There are social and emotional learning curriculums that are in place in certain schools to encourage some of those behaviors, to build character and confidence, connections with other students. All of those things speak to resiliency.
Thank you. I think our next question is directed towards both Amanda and Sue. For those who are viewing, you'll find that we have questions in mind for specific panelists, but I've also asked the panelists if they have something they want to add or contribute. Feel free to jump in. I'll try and make things a little less formal if possible. So Amanda and Sue, if you could speak to some of the things that you think parents and schools can do collaboratively to support the overall social and emotional wellness of our kids. Go.
Just because.
Green button on. So I think the word collaborate, you asked in the question, is really it. It's a partnership. So schools and families need to partner together to support the kids. They need to foster a relationship. They need to make a connection. They need to, both in school and at home, observe their kids and watch their kids and listen to their kids. And just be available. Provide a safe structure and healthy environment for them, both at home and at school, and don't go it alone.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that I would add was something that somebody brought up at a meeting, and in fact, it was a meeting that Sue was also present with me, and that was the idea that our kids are living in a time that's extraordinarily different from what we lived through. And the more we hold on to our ideas about what these kids should be thinking or feeling or how they should be behaving in 2021 at 15 or 16, the further away we are from them. We need to recognize that their lives are different than ours. Mm-hmm. And that kind of speaks to what Sue suggested about observing, paying attention, being available, and sometimes recognizing that your kid needs a connection with someone that they can talk to, and whether or not that is you might be a different question. And maybe it isn't you, but maybe you can help direct them to somebody safe and good for them to have as a sounding board, as someone that they can talk to. And that's a difficult thing for parents sometimes, to realize that they might not be the best person. The important thing is that their kid have a person.
Well said.
So this question is directed at Amanda, and we will back off of you soon. This question is directed at Amanda, but other panelists, please feel free to jump in. Being at the collegiate level, are there things you wish you could say to parents to prepare their children before they go to post-secondary education?
Oh, boy.
I added this one.
Actually, Matt could probably address that question as well. because,
I have some notes.
because he also works with college students. I think that one of the things that we know, and I think this is going to be addressed later in the discussion, is about protective and risk factors for suicide. And one of the things that we know to be a risk factor for everyone is periods of transition. So for kids, that might be high school to college, it might even be college to a job in another city, right? But the transition periods tend to be dangerous times for people. So all by itself, the transition into college can be difficult for kids. I think parents can prepare them a little bit by kind of having that conversation. This isn't just, yeehaw, I'm on my own. There's a lot to the transition. There's a lot to understanding what it's like to be on your own and maybe alone at times. And kind of engaging and touching base and encouraging them. I talk to a lot of parents at the university about kids kind of finding their tribe on a university campus, and I think there's so many opportunities for them now, but they kind of have to do that, and they're not going to come to them, in other words. It's not quite as simple as it was in high school. You have to make some of those opportunities, and those are good things, I think, to encourage kids to find that, and I think parents' engagement encourages that.
I'd say I'd go back to, as a parent, I'd let your kids fail a little bit before they go to college. We all fail, all of us. In fact, some of the most successful people in the world have failed many, many, many times. And because of that, they've learned to become resilient. They've learned to get through those kinds of things. And when they're on their own, when they fail, they have the tools and the resources and the skills to manage those kinds of things. Because I think one of the biggest challenges I see sometimes, of course, I work in a medical school, so we have, the people that were the top of your high school class, they were near the top of your graduating class in college, they show up in medical school, we got 280 of them in a class, and somebody's ranked 280. The person's brilliant. But it's hard to see it through that lens sometimes because they sit there and go, wait, but compared to somebody else, they're like, we need to let our kids fail a little bit before they go into these other places in life, because it's a chance for them to learn how to get through it. And as a parent, it's how do we have conversations about how we're not always going to have everything handed to us. Not that the kids are expecting that stuff, but we need to be able to manage failure, because they're not going to pass everything perfectly all the time. It just isn't going to happen.
Our next question is actually for anyone on the group, and I will also add some of these questions were specifically given for this event, and then I will also say some of these have been questions that I think have been asked at other sort of parent events, and so in an effort to sort of include those, we have done such. This is very relevant. You and I were talking about this before we started. What can we do in our homes to positively change this culture of stress and anxiety, especially during and since the pandemic?
Since I'm getting the look.
I'll give you the look.
So, thank you for having me, and the panelists have been amazing so far. And what I heard and the word collaboration, I wanted to highlight a couple times in my answers, so I'm going to start with that, is since this is an unprecedented time, since we've never lived through this as well, collaborating with your kids and not being afraid to talk to your kids and open up about the uncertainty of how things are going to go through, but to really not be afraid to have conversations, vulnerable conversations, real conversations. I learned as much as I did from my father's success as well as his failures. I learned from other people's mistakes and families finding a way and a pocket to be vulnerable about a parent sharing, their own vulnerabilities of how they deal with the stress and anxiety themselves and what self-skills they do. You talk about coping skills and how do you teach resiliency and how you teach coping skills. Kids watch what parents do way more than they listen to what you say. So it's how you conduct yourselves, how you live, how you conduct in relative terms. So especially during the pandemic, guess what? Everybody was home. Everybody was able to look at each other. And so you were under a microscope, so your kids saw exactly how you conducted yourself for the past, however long. But now as we're working ourselves through this and hopefully getting back to some sense of the new norm, I don't know what to call it, but what I know is that collaboratively talking about it, having families being able to share how they got through it is really important.
I would concur with that, and I think that the only thing that I would add is that, to your point, and I think it's a really important one, that kids watch what you do a lot more than listen to what you say. And we've become a culture of busy is king, right? We're all very, very, very busy. And I think not modeling any sort of self-care or downtime for our kids because we're so crazy busy is inspiring them to feel like if they're not in the same, right? They're not super busy and involved in 100 things and overcommitted in most cases, they're not keeping up. And so I think that we as parents tend to lack in the modeling of that self-care, asserting some boundaries in our time and space and allowing ourselves downtime, both to enjoy with our kids, but also to allow for the fact that we need downtime too. It makes us better and more productive people in general, and it helps us learn how to manage stress better. And those are all things that we can begin by modeling at home.
May I just add on top of that too? In addition to that, I think we also need to help to establish routines with the expectation of self-care in that, but having kids know what to expect, having some things in their life that is typical, that they know when they can eat breakfast, or they know when they should go to bed, or they know when they should turn their cell phone off, or they know when it's time to just hang out.
This question is directed to Mike. What are some things that parents can do to foster balance between expectations and pressure? And what are your recommendations in regards to how often parents should be monitoring grades, access to social media, cell phone use, etc.?
That was great. Yeah. And what Sue just talked about, the balance, of how much and when and where. One of the conversations I just had with a family is like, to have a conversation, if parents are set up in the role that a kid walks in the door and the kid knows exactly that mom or dad are going to ask every single time, every chance they get, how are you doing in school, what's going on, then you're just representing the parent has lost all those other aspects of that person, and you're just holding your kid accountable, and you think you're doing the right thing by being the parent. But what happens is then that kid doesn't want to open up at all, it doesn't want to share, doesn't want to, so you want to balance out like the amount of other conversations that you have, so it's not just your role to kind of question and check their cell phone usage or check what's going on in their grades. And it's a great, amazing time, that technology that we have, this great technology that you as a parent can look up and see everything, but it's sometimes not the best, you know what I mean? Because you don't see the 100 other decisions that the kid makes during the day. In healthier decisions around how they interact in the lunchroom doesn't get reported on a grade. So when it comes to performance and development and how a kid can develop, some of that doesn't end up on a letter grade. So it ends up in their emotional grade, which you as a family get to talk through and open up. And so when it comes to this thing, one of the partial reasons Sarah asked me to talk about the impact of technology is that's my research, and what I've seen in adolescence is the impact of technology on adolescent development, and brought to you by the pandemic. I don't know about the parents or the families in this audience or online, but so many of the families that I work with are just tired. They're just burnt out. So when they get to this thing called a cell phone or iPad or whatever, they're just like happy that their kid is not screaming or yelling or getting in a fight, so they're just happy, so they'll just give them this thing. And we've had 16, 18 months of kind of unruly time with technology. And I'm not saying it has to go back to this complete nothing, but we've got to have a conversation today, or start having conversations today as we're going back to schools, as we're going back to the fall, and to be upfront about the conversation of what Sue talked about, and to really clarify and reclaim and reclarify technology-free Tuesday and Thursday nights, or technology-free dinners, or technology-free zones in the house, that you want to create a safe space for kids to open up and talk, because this thing called technology is also a thing of, I thought I wouldn't have to teach FOMO. I'm in a lot of schools in prevention, and I didn't think FOMO was going to continue in the pandemic. For those people that don't know what FOMO means, I'm sorry, fear of missing out. You know, and during the pandemic, I thought everybody was locked in their own homes, you know, right? Everybody was supposed to be told to be at home. But guess what? Kids were still feeling left out because a group of kids would go party and not, you know, but somehow it ended up on Snapchat or TikTok or whatever. So they felt like other kids were able to do things without their parents' permission, and they were able to get away with stuff. So FOMO existed, and now FOMO is even worse this summer, you know, is because a lot of kids are trying to make up for lost time. I don't know if you've heard that or not, but so that's my fear of FOMO, and so kids are trying to live up to that. So how do parents talk about it? A simple intervention is this. How many people in here remember the show Columbo, the Columbo show? Every day, kids think I'm an idiot, which I am 100% an idiot, but I want kids to think, and I want to learn from kids. I want to learn from them. They're a better teacher about what's the latest TikTok, what's the latest Snapchat, and I scratch my head and I get them to teach me about what their For You page is. Have you ever sat with your kids? Have you ever actually sat with them and seen on their device what their For You page looks like? Because the algorithm behind their For You page is so specific to them. You could learn a lot from sitting with them and scrolling through and seeing what their interests are. The Wall Street Journal just came out with this major research on TikTok and how this algorithm is 50 times that of YouTube channels. And this algorithm's been around for about 20 years, so it is so addicting and it affects us so much. It's a setup for addiction, which I can get into in a further question. If you want me to be quiet, I will. So they warned me to not talk that long, so I apologize. So that answers that question. So have a conversation, act like a Columbo, ask questions, get your kid to talk about it.
Thank you.
I think you actually answered my next question already. So I am going to move forward a little bit. This one is for Sue and Amanda, or any of the panelists. How would you suggest we foster connections for students both in the classroom and in the community? You talked a little bit about it earlier, if you wanted to revisit any aspects.
So I think we foster connections by allowing time to have those connections. So in the schools, times for kids to come together in a meaningful manner, whether it's in the classroom and group activities, whether it's through group activities by guidance and school counselors, whether it's through after-school sports or clubs, whether it's through the theater, the arts, the music within the school, and then within the community, engaging in all the wonderful things that Chester County has to offer. Starting with things as simple as the YMCA, your neighborhood, your PTOs, anything that you can do to foster some kind of activity outside of your home.
I agree with that. I think there's a lot of engagement, and that kind of comes back to modeling those things as well, because not everybody has a kid who is a joiner, right? So sometimes I happen to have one, in fact, who is not. And so my level of engagement often influences hers. So if I sought to be the parent who said, go out and find a club to join, I'm pretty sure that wouldn't end well. So sometimes I think there's engagement that has to be modeled and maybe participated alongside with your kids. Find something that they like that you can participate in with them, at least to get them kind of off the ground. Sometimes they just need the entree into the group. So I think that's how we foster connections. And obviously that fosters one between you and your child, as well as potentially opening doors for them and others. And I think that's also a good thing to set up. I know a lot of kids, particularly kids who are athletes, have great connections with coaches and teams, and that has to do with common goals and spending so much time together. So to Sue's point, the time together helps a lot. Engaging in activities where you work side by side at something, whether they're athletic or otherwise. Contributing helps to those things as well.
And to both your points, it's creating the opportunities for these things to happen in the first place, and leaving space for this in the med school. We had an interesting scenario last year where essentially you had, beginning in July when the new class came through, everything was virtual. So here you had 280 people in a class, but they were never in a classroom auditorium together. We always break them into these groups of 10 for this sort of case-based learning thing we had. And they go through that for a couple of months, then they switch with a new group, and they have a new group. Last year was the first time I've ever seen it where they switched with a new group, and they got into a room with students that they had never met before. It's never been that way. So we were always having opportunities where we'd sort of sit there, we'd spend the first 10 minutes just chatting about what's going on, who's doing what. You know, we were starting to have opportunities to do things outside of their apartments. And so it was like, what are you doing these days? Have people been somewhere? They recommend other people to go. And it really gave them opportunities to start connecting and talking and learning about each other through the process of it. You know, we'd have these Zoom meetings, and it would end at noon. And here I'm the host of the meeting. I would turn that meeting over to one, now I don't know that you do this in high school, but I would turn that over to one of the other students and let them be the host. I would check out. They'd have lunch together so that they could talk to each other and get to know each other and stuff like that. But you have to create the opportunities, or these things just don't happen.
Can I add one more thing? I think about the student or the child who has difficulty making connections. It's really helpful if you're a parent and you have a child who has difficulty that you reach out to the teacher, that you reach out to a school counselor, that you reach out to even the school nurse or your administrators or your principal, and just make it known that you think you have a child who needs a little extra. Our educators try to be on tune 100% to every student in the building, but you know there's a lot of kids in the building. So as a parent and as an educator and as a social worker, I encourage you to reach out and make the connection. There's a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of things that if we had a little extra nudge, the teacher can maybe join somebody together for lunch or create an opportunity for them to make a friend or to be with a pal. So you'll hear me say a lot, reach out, make the connection so that we can help.
Thank you. This question is directed to Sue again.
Me again. Oh my gosh.
Welcome.
Downingtown has supports and resources, as do many school districts in Chester County and beyond, things like school counselors, nurses, social workers and prevention specialists, home and school visitors, psychologists, the list goes on. Can you speak to other supports and what supports you think are helpful in the community and throughout the county that would perhaps, or in other public education settings that you've seen that are valuable to student intervention?
Wow, that's a hard question. It's a hard question because Downingtown seems to cover the majority of the things that I would tell other districts, hey, have you thought about this or have you thought about that? You'll hear me say with people that I talk about, we learn from every year what worked and what didn't work and what we need more of. And sometimes it's not a different role, but maybe more of or a shift in focus. Some of the things that we've started to see throughout the county, instead of just supporting our students with special education needs with mental health intervention, moving towards more of a tiered level of support with identifying kids through the MTSS process and trying to support them before the problems are bigger. So you guys are doing a great job.
You know, I have to add something to that because
Vitam.
because of the task force and the association we have in the community at large, not simply a single school district, that I have the benefit sometimes of speaking with people in other task forces in other parts of the state. And I think we, in this community in particular, lose sight of how rich we are in resources, how much more we do not just in Downingtown, but in Downingtown, in Westchester, in many of the school districts here. There's, and could anybody do more? Of course, right? We can always find more things to do and maybe more effective things to do. We're always working on that. But I think sometimes there's no point of comparison in the community, so it feels like there must be something more. And again, certainly there are other things, but there's quite a lot being done in the community-wide, area that we live in Chester County.
And I'll also add, too, that I think the other thing that we do very well in Chester County is we have a very strong district council team. So team members from other school districts are gathering together and sharing information on a monthly basis on how they are assisting students and how they are intervening and how they are making a difference and what's worked for them and what hasn't worked. So there's a wealth of knowledge that we learn from all the time.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple questions. Throwing you a curveball. They're still directed towards you, Sue.
I know they are.
But beyond sort of the staffing, if you will, question from the last one, this one is actually more oriented towards just curriculum, not just curriculum, but curriculum that you've seen to be effective either in teaching social and emotional skills or perhaps even coping strategies or mindfulness.
So you could do a wonderful Google search on evidence-based curriculum that is effective with school-age students, and you'd get an array of different answers. The one thing that I think that is the most important is that you pick one and you implement it and you do it and then you check it and then you do it and then you implement it and then you do it and you do it across all levels, right? So you can't just say I'm going to do this, put it out there, and then say it's done. So it's a commitment from the teachers and from the people who are implementing it that it's going to get done. And then we're going to do it this year, and we're going to do it next year, and we're going to build upon the things that our students are learning. There's a number of curriculums that we've used that are used throughout the county and through the IU. The PASS curriculum we use for our little guys tends to be that way. Second Step has been a fabulous curriculum that we've used. I wrote those down just so I wouldn't forget them. Coping Cat, Mind Up. Coatesville used Mind Up a few years back, and that was very effective in their schools. Skill streaming, but like I said, there are many things that you can Google, but the point is you have to implement it universally, not just for certain students, but across all grounds. Thanks. You're welcome.
Thank you. Sue, you're not off the hook yet.
You're trying really hard.
So you oversee a number of programs that include mental health staff as part of your programs at the CCIU. Could you talk a little bit about what you believe is the efficacy behind providing mental health treatment to schools and students? And what are some of the strengths of that model and some of the challenges to that model?
So, it's a tricky thing to say, did it work or it didn't work, right? So, as far as I'm concerned, when kids get intervention, it has to be helpful. How could it not be helpful? Students are being identified and supported early on. They're getting intervention, they're getting connections, they're getting outside treatment, we're making supports and referrals. It's a collaborative adventure, but we're able to reach the kids because they're here and they're present in the school. Some kids need a little more, some kids need a little less. You have the ability to identify frequency and intensity and provide that to students. So that's the pluses, right? Probably the difficulty is we could always use more. Just like with everything that you have, you could always use more. You could use more school counselors, you can use more prevention specialists, you could use more teachers, you could use more everything. But kids are being reached at school in the moment, especially with our younger students and their depending on where they're at, you're able to do a lot of in-the-moment intervention, so they're learning how to interact with kids, how to manage disappointment, how to manage failure, how to figure out how to do it better the next time. And we try to give them skills and strategies that they will use not only in the classroom, but moving forward through life. Did I answer all that?
You did. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks.
To someone other than Sue. No, I'm kidding. But this one is actually oriented towards anyone. Okay. Sue, you're off the hook.
Thanks.
Although I'm thinking everyone has probably had this experience, and I'm imagining some of our parents or anybody viewing may have also had this experience. How can we teach our students to accurately reflect what they're feeling versus making certain statements like I can't deal with life or I'm going to kill myself? It's a heavy one.
Language is a really tough thing. So my name's Mike, and I can speak. In all sincerity, I do feel that we as adults need to talk more accurately about how we are doing and what we do about our stress and how we conduct ourselves around stress. So I think more accurately talking through the gamut, the spectrum of emotions, so it's not just singling out and going to extremes. In these extreme times, there's been extreme talk, extreme language, and trying to find the spectrum of emotion and the emotional development is learning how to communicate boredom, frustration, and there was this classic picture, if you remember in high school, you probably saw this classic picture of all these people's faces and all the emotions underneath, and the further I get away and the further I get down my research hole of all the great things I want to share and teach you, I go back to that simple thing of learning how to teach emotional communication of what is the real emotion. Anger is the most misdiagnosed feeling, for instance. So often underneath the anger of the driver is fear, anxiety, uncertainty, insecurity. So it's learning how to talk about insecurity in a safe way. And so I think fostering a safer place for families and individuals to feel safe to open up. And I'm okay with the kids saying, I don't know. I'm okay with the kids saying, as a treatment provider, as a therapist that sits with your kids and the families, I'm okay with you saying, I don't know, is a better answer than saying, I know the answer. I'm okay with them saying, I don't know.
I agree. I think it's important to hear what's being communicated. It's important to help young people in particular kind of differentiate what they mean by the words. Again, back to the language kind of issue. So somebody says, I just don't want to be here anymore, or I want to die, or whatever it might be, that may be how they really feel. The problem that we run into sometimes is that we get anxious and worried when we hear those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And so we assume that they're just saying this as like they're overstating how they really feel. It's anxiety, it's worry, it's something like that. It's not really that they want to die. And so we minimize it. And when we do that, it tells them that that experience is valid, or that I'm not paying attention to what you have to say, or it doesn't matter, or something along those lines. And the problem that we have then is, then how do you communicate those kinds of experiences? And so we're stuck with sitting there going, that's not how they really feel. Like denial is a parent's like #1 tool about a lot of things that goes on. No, it's not happening. But if we engage them around, hold on a second. What did you just say? Like, help me, is this, like, let's talk about this. Having that conversation, making it clear that this is important. And if it's, okay, if it's not really I want to die, but it's I'm frustrated, there's something else going on, I'm not feeling good about this, all right, how do we put those words to that statement? Because if it isn't that you don't want to die, that's important. If it is that you do, that's important too. So we need to really understand those kinds of things, but we need to make our job to make sure we're not only hearing it, paying attention to it, and responding to it. Otherwise, we minimize it, we invalidate it, and kids don't know how to express it.
I want to add one comment to the language issue, because it's one of the primary things we teach when we teach suicide prevention classes. And actually, it is the language that we use, and making sure that you're able to have those conversations that include that language. So not being afraid to say the word to your son or daughter who has mentioned suicide or something like it, or something, anything that you're kind of understanding to be that, not being afraid to say directly to your child, are you thinking of suicide? Because one of the things that we know in the suicide prevention world is that actually putting the words out there very directly and shining a light on them is a way to bring those feelings out of the dark, and feelings that most people, not even just young people, adults as well, are not comfortable talking about. So we know that it's difficult for people to talk about feeling like they want to die, and if we demonstrate that we're not going to be scared away to have the conversation, we can use the language, we can have the conversation, we can put it right out there on the table to talk about, then we allow the individual to feel the same level of comfort about it, to feel like it's safe to have this conversation. I don't have to worry that if I admit to my parent that I'm actually thinking of suicide, that they're going to run from the room or quick call 911. Like, we can have this conversation without anybody freaking out. That's a really important thing. It's not only important if you fear that in your own children, although that's even probably more critically important, but it's important now in a community that's dealing with post-suicide issues. So those kids that knew someone, they need to know that they can have a frank conversation with their parents about suicide, because somebody they know has just been lost to suicide. And they can't feel like this is a word we can't say in our house, because then they internalize everything. And that's a really unsafe place for them to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. This next question is directed to Matt, and it's actually 3 questions, so I'm going to break it down for you. So we'll ask one at a time.
Lightning round.
What are the warning signs and symptoms for a child or adolescent who may be displaying a mental health or behavioral concern? What are some things or behaviors you would look for?
So the second question is easier than the first.
Would you like to speak to the second?
Well, I think the challenge with that is, what is a mental health or behavioral concern? And I think that's where it's hard to really have a clear answer to the question, because I think the challenge is, I know later you're going to ask me about age differences, but one of the things that we know is that younger people tend to act out more, they show more irritability and so on and so forth, whereas teenagers are more likely to be more internalized, keep things in, more anxiety, more depression, et cetera. Parents don't always see those kinds of things. I can give you examples of kids that I've worked with that have come from families where the parents were paying attention to the kids who were acting out. And they thought, well, my daughter, who's 15 and has been in her room for the last year and a half, she's fantastic. She doesn't cause any problems at all. And so the problem is they miss the depression, they miss the suicidal thoughts sometimes because you don't see those things. I think it's important, not just in looking at mental health and behavioral problems, but also when we think about suicide risk, to be thinking about people being different than they usually are. It's when somebody's acting differently. Part of it's normal development to some degree. Is I think it was G. Stanley Hall in 1904 talked about adolescence as a period of storm and stress. I think I have the year right even on that one. But here we are a century later, and I don't think that's terribly off. But it's evolved over a lot of time. And so it's sort of understanding that everyone goes through some bumps in the road, and that's a normal piece of it. Does it impact and interfere with school, interfere with relationships, interfere with those kinds of things in their life? That's when you start saying, well, let's pay attention to this. The other thing that parents do sometimes is, again, we talk about denial, but sometimes we're going to observe and wait. And sometimes we wait too long. And so when we notice things that feel a little bit different, a little bit out of the ordinary, not the way that they typically are, I think that's when we, let's have a conversation. I've noticed this, this, and this. It's a little bit different than what you've done before. Let's talk about this. So it's hard to answer kind of the mental health kind of piece, because what is it and who are we talking about here? But yeah.
So let's go to number 2, which is a little more direct. Are there specific warning signs that should be acknowledged as indicators for someone who might be having thoughts of suicide?
Yes. Simple answer is yes. The difficult answer is that every person is unique and different. And so how they exhibit these things isn't always the same across every person. If it were, the the suicide rate in this country would go down dramatically because we'd be able to go, okay, this plus this equals do something now. It's not quite that simple. But there are, in fact, warning signs that we've generated from lots of years of research, from lots of clinical work, from working and talking with people who have lost young people to suicide. You know, what were the experiences that they saw in their family prior to that person's suicide attempt and death? And so there's really 4 major areas to be looking for. The first is obviously anyone talking about or anything related to exploring, talking about, thinking about suicide. If you're talking about social media use and stuff like that, you get on somebody's phone and they've been looking up, you know, something about suicide methods or whatever. That's not when we sit there and go, I'm going to hold on to this information and see if there's more data that comes out about it. Let's have that conversation. So talking about suicide is important. The second thing is a sense of hopelessness. And it's important to recognize it's not hopeless like this pandemic's never going to end kind of hopelessness. It is hopelessness in the sense of I have tried again and again and again to get better. I have never in my life met a person with suicidal thoughts who did not work just incredibly hard to get rid of those thoughts. People don't want to feel that way. But they're trying and trying and trying. And whether it is reality or a perception, there is always some barrier that continuously gets in the way, so it feels like I can't get over it. No matter what I do, I can't get over it. And so it turns into this sense of hopelessness that no matter what I do, nothing will get better. The third has to do with a sense of overwhelming emotional pain, which is an interesting kind of concept because if you talk to individuals who made life-threatening suicide attempts and you ask them about the experience they were having right before the suicide attempt, many will talk about, they won't use that word necessarily, overwhelming emotional pain, but they'll talk about this conceptual experience of feeling like something was greater than them. They couldn't manage it, they couldn't deal with it, they didn't know how to handle it. And of course, as adults, I always see that as something very internal. It's like, well, how do I see that in somebody? What does that look like in somebody else? And we had collected some data on this years ago, and what we found is that people often described it as, if you look at somebody and they have sort of this combined experience of emotion kind of happening at the same time. So the person who looks sad but angry at the same time, or tearful and angry at the same time, like those kinds of combination things, is something to be paying attention to. One person sort of described it as similar to an experience of somebody having a migraine. You know, sometimes people with migraines get tearful. Well, they're not tearful because like they're sad. They're tearful because they want this to like just stop. I just want it to go away. And that's the experience, this wanting it to go away and feeling like you have like no control over it. And the last has to do with a bunch of different behavioral changes. And so again, behavioral change has to do with somebody acting, behaving differently than they usually do. So the first has to do with changes in sleep. We see it's a classic symptom of depression. Some kids, some adults for that matter, sleep a lot when they're depressed. Some people hardly sleep at all. So it's not, you know, if they're in bed all the time, then that means they must be depressed. Some people are up at all hours, and then they're still up at 6 o'clock in the morning the next day going to school, and they seem to be functioning, I don't say functioning reasonably well, but they're getting by. They're not manic necessarily, but the point is we run into these sleep issues, and that's an important thing to be looking for. The second thing has to do with changes in social situations. And so it isn't you completely withdraw from everything. I think that's the misconception, is that if somebody's suicidal, they're going to pull away from everything that they experience, and they don't, you know, they drop out of clubs, they're not involved in other things. It doesn't always play out that way. But they oftentimes disengage from important things or important people in their life. And a lot of teenagers that I've spoken to have, you know, after having made a suicide attempt, would come in and I would ask them a little bit about that experience before that had happened. They were pushing people away. They wanted to disengage with people, partly because they felt if I disengage with other people, then there's no connection there. If I can break that connection, then I can free myself of any responsibility, which is a very planful way of thinking about this. And it's quite sad if you think about it kind of from that perspective. But that social disconnection is something to be paying attention to. So people are dropping out of things that seem to be important and useful, that they enjoyed a whole lot before. You got a star athlete on a team one year, the next year they come back out, but they don't come out for that team. Like, you might want to say, hey, what's going on? And people usually do, but they don't ask the right questions about it. The 2 other things have to do with irritability and agitation, and anger, hostility, out of character or out of context for who they are. So again, if you have somebody at home who's a little bit more irritable anyway, that's not necessarily, I mean, yes, we want to pay attention to it, but that isn't telling us something. But if it's different than how someone usually is, if they're responding to something in a way that's very different than other students would respond to it or something like that, that's important to kind of get connected around that.
Thank you. And there's one last part to this that I know you knew was coming. Can you talk about, if any varied responses you might see in regards to someone who might be having thoughts of suicide in regards to their age or developmental level?
Yeah, it's a great research question to which we don't have a whole lot of data right now. There's a couple of areas in the world of suicide prevention that we could be doing better work in or more work in, and you know, these things are starting to grow and develop. One has to do with, you know, developmental disabilities, autism, for example, and kind of understanding the connection there. I think there's a lot of good work happening there. The second has to do with younger kids and suicide risk, and you know, the warning signs that I just described for you is really thinking about kind of teenagers up to kind of young adulthood. We don't have good data right now on what does this look like for someone who's 10 years old or 8 years old, and I know no one wants to sit there and think about an 8-year-old being suicidal. There's data. And so the problem is, well, the good news, I should say, is the base rate is so low. In other words, there's so few people of that age that are dying by suicide, it's really hard to understand that phenomenon very well. But we do see with depression in particular, you see a lot of irritability and agitation, which is different than, again, the internalizing experience. So kids acting out and stuff like that, we really want to engage them around that. As Mike was saying before, you know, anger is, I always think about it as a secondary emotion. It's not the primary emotion. There's always something underneath it. So when kids are acting out, it's not that they're angry and frustrated. That's what they're showing us. But what's underneath that anger and frustration? And so understanding that's so critically important. But you'll see the anger, the frustration, the acting.
Thank you.
Our next question is for actually both Matt and Mike, although again, anyone on the panel can speak to it. How do we differentiate between what is typical, not an easy question, typical child or adolescent development versus a more significant sort of behavioral or mental health challenge? Translation, I'm thinking of when you're on the phone with a parent who says, this is what's happening and I don't know what to do, when should we be worried? Which I feel like both of you probably have had conversations with parents to that point.
I would like to piggyback first on what Matt presented, is A, resistance is normal for adolescents and families and parents. A lot of parents don't want to see this issue. A lot of kids don't want to see this issue. So resistance is normal. So it's kind of like building a case, and you have to be a lawyer, a judge, and everything else. And in that case, meaning you have to take all the evidence and not just single out a pop-up fly as one evidence and say, all right, just because of this one piece, then I'm going to act out, or that's what I'm going to go on. But I look for a pattern of behavior. I just don't look for one indicator. As you said, the 4 pieces was great. I was wondering where you're going with the 4, what ones were popping out the most in research. And I really liked how it wasn't just one component, one core issue, but the shift in the pattern of behavior. Understanding the baseline is really important, of understanding your family, your kids' baseline interactions, abilities to interact, abilities coping, and then seeing a shift in that dynamic, that clear shift, as opposed to some kids, you know, their baseline might be different, so they might have more social events and more social pieces and be out and about, and then all of a sudden be more isolative. But if a kid's starting out isolative, it doesn't mean anything. It's just understanding their baseline activity level to understand what's going to happen next. So it's a pattern of behavior, not just one single event. Does that make sense, Matt?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And to your point about who sees what and so on and so forth, like, I always start a conversation about this is a collaboration. You know, I'm working with parents. And, you know, I am never going to know your kid better than you know your kid. Never going to happen. So we have to collaborate together, but I always make sure the kids also know, listen, your parents from time to time might tell me some things about what's going on. Like I used to have parents that would call me on the phone, leave me voicemail messages, sometimes at length, about things that were going on at home, but the kids always knew that this kind of thing would happen. But they also knew that I wasn't sitting there calling their parents back and saying, well, this is what your kid told me today, and those kinds of things. So there's a collaborative kind of piece to that in terms of what's going on, but it's always a collaboration in terms of working through these discussions and making some headway. So the data collection ends up coming from lots of different sources, but everybody's informed about the fact that the data may show up one day when we don't expect it.
I think having families on board and families' involvement as well is a critical piece, and not just looking at the individual adolescent, but really seeing what's the forces behind and who's, another big assessment piece I look at is who's bringing the child or who's making the phone call. And treatment begins at the initial onset of the phone call, and continues throughout, and the reassessment and assessment from a treatment perspective happens throughout that process.
Did you want to add anything, Sue, or? No?
Good.
Okay.
This next question, you guys talked a little bit about, it being normal to feel a little bit of resistance from students as you begin talking about these topics. Do you, and this is really for anybody on the panel, any strategies you would recommend to parents who are trying to open a conversation with their child? They have some suspicions that there might be some, concerns there, but they're meeting that resistance. Any strategies you would recommend?
Don't give up.
Yep.
Continue the conversation. Do not be afraid to sit there in silence. One of my favorite clients quotes me years and years later. I sat with her in silence for a long time until she was ready to talk. So, yes, I've had favorite clients. I'm very sorry about that. That's true. But the truth is, in all sincerity, do not give up. I will talk to kids about anything they're willing to talk about at first to get them talking and opening up. So I will ask them what is on their TikTok, what is on anything to get any clear conversation going. So meeting them where they are doesn't mean talking down to them, doesn't mean talking at them. It means just being inquisitive, asking them questions, and not giving up for the potential opportunity, which, by the way, 87% of communication is nonverbal. So how you ask a question, how you frame a question, and then how a kid answers will tell on their posturing, their stance, their tonality. So listen to all the things they're not saying, not in just in what they are saying, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, persistence was the first word I had on my little sheet here too, is, be persistent. The other thing that I find works sometimes too is sort of asking the hypothetical question. Like if you really are concerned about something's going on and you've got, you're collecting evidence and the evidence is kind of there that there's something we need to talk about, don't be afraid to say, what do you imagine would happen if we talked about this? What do you imagine I would do if you told me about whatever it happens to be and stuff like that? But then you have to be open and willing to hear the fact the kids might have a very honest answer about what you might say or do about whatever it is. It's a hypothetical conversation. They're not at this stage saying, oh, I'm doing this, this, or this. But if I were to tell you about drugs, for example, or something like that, you'd flip your lid, you'd do this, this, and this. If you're being honest with yourself, you might actually flip your lid and do the things that your kids are saying. So you have to sort of step back for a second and say, I can imagine why then you perhaps wouldn't want to talk to me about this.
Right. There's a reason they're saying that.
Yeah. But having that hypothetical conversation what it does is it opens up the conversation for what's getting in the way of us actually talking about this. Because if you're afraid that I'm going to say X, Y, or Z, then I can understand maybe why you wouldn't say that. I wonder if we can have a conversation about how you would want me to react about this or what this might be like and so on, and then eventually through that, the conversation evolves into, well, this is what's going on.
Right. It makes me think of the Melissa Etheridge song, Come to My Window, right? Which the essence of that song is about you can't always do things through the front door. Sometimes you have to go to the window. You have to find another way in. And I think there are so many sort of subtle ways to have those conversations. I used to say to parents a lot, when you're in the car, there are these great opportunities when you don't have to look at them and they don't have to look at you. And sometimes you can get away with saying things in that moment that you couldn't maybe say if you were sitting across from each other at the dinner table where it feels a little more intense. And I think that's all about figuring out how to start that conversation, and maybe you have to start it from a couple of different perspectives.
Another piece that I appreciate you guys mentioned that is to not put pressure on yourself as parents, meaning I work with a lot of parents that think that all of a sudden they're going to turn 18 and they're going to run away or go off to college, and I only have another year them in this house, and then sometimes they don't leave. I don't know if you've heard this or not. But in all sincerity, the truth is you don't want to put pressure on yourself as a parent to not have all the answers. You want to have the ability to ask the question, and again, finding that right zone might be for you in the car, that kid might feel trapped in the car, so it depends. Sometimes their dinner at home might be a safer place. So it really kind of lends to each individual kid's needs and trying to find their sweet spot, or what Sue was talking about earlier is try to find that consistent spot. If you have Tuesday night dinners or Saturday morning breakfast or whatever routines that you can instill, because it does take that consistency as well.
Next question is directed to Matt, although you may all have differing opinions or different perspectives based on where you work. What is the best practice process for responding to a child experiencing a mental health crisis?
The best practice for this?
I know.
You know, I think the hardest part is remaining calm yourself through it to some degree. I mean, you know, it goes back to our kids see what we're doing and how we're handling things. And if our kid is in a crisis and we then join their crisis, that doesn't settle anything down very quickly. You know, I think the number one thing that parents want to do is calm everything down and tell them it's going to be okay. And you know, I think that's rooted in sort of the behavior of when you have a young child and you know they've hurt themselves or something and they start crying because they banged their knee or whatever it was, and you tell them it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, and you know because you know for the most part that's true, it's going to be okay. And when we're talking about mental health crises, you may not know what it is that's going on in the first place. Telling them it's going to be okay may, certainly in the mind of a teenager, turn into you don't get it. You're not going to understand what I have to say to you. So it's important to help calm them down, but we do that through modeling. We do that through letting them know that you're there for them, it's safe, you care about them, validate their feelings, you know, acknowledge what's going on, showing them affection, show them that you care. Listen. You know, we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should probably be listening about at least twice as much as we talk, perhaps more. As a parent, we want to fix everything. Our kids have a problem. We say, my job is to fix it. Some things we cannot fix. And shouldn't put our, you know, back to putting pressure on yourself, you shouldn't put the pressure on yourself to have to fix everything. But it's difficult to give up that desire. You know, but listening helps us to learn more. And then as we listen, what do we do next? We ask questions. I want to learn more about it, ask questions. And so as we're helping to kind of calm them down through validating this experience and going through those kinds of things, you know, once they've sort of settled down and they're talking and we're listening and we're asking more questions and we're understanding it better, then we're at least at a playing field where we can think about what is it we need to do together. Oftentimes it's, you know, how can I be helpful? Is there something I can do? You know, those kinds of moments. But sometimes it's, let's see who we can get you connected to. Like sometimes these things, like parents shouldn't have to feel like they have to do this stuff on their own. You know, there are other people that are out there that can be helpful, and so how do you get connected to those folks? And very quickly, a teaching moment that I always do with our new child psychiatry fellows when they come to Jefferson is, I always remind them, I say, what would it be like for you as a parent to pick up the phone and call a mental health professional to ask them for help? As a parent, what does that mean? So you'll always have to know that people are coming, like, what did it take to pick up the phone in the first place to make the call? You know, when the book that you got when all your kids were born was You Fix Everything. So you have to sort of acknowledge that everybody's coming to this in a really difficult, vulnerable spot right now. Nobody's feeling great about it, but sometimes you need to be able to reach out for the support, and encouraging other adults to do those kinds of things is just a really important thing.
Thank you.
So this next question is another multi-layered question, so we'll start at the beginning. This is directed at Matt and Amanda, but certainly other members of our panel can join in. Could you discuss any data trends there are currently around suicide, things like prevalence rates, risk factors, protective factors, and the role of social media?
This is where I'm glad you guys gave us the questions ahead of time so I could actually get some actual real numbers. Because the misconception right now is that we are in the middle of a pandemic. The suicide rate and the number of suicides must be going up. We know there are more people depressed and anxious than before. I don't know if that's entirely true. I think what that is a reflection of the fact that people who were somewhat depressed and somewhat anxious in the midst of isolation, in the midst of a whole bunch of other things, those things started surfacing a little bit more, and some of the skills and resources and tools to manage those things weren't as available as they'd been before, and now you saw greater rates of depression, anxiety, and other internalizing problems. The interesting twist to all of it is that the suicide deaths in this country and in this state, and based on the data that Amanda has, and in this county, have gone down. So if you look at data, both nationally for all ages, but even young people, say like, I think I looked at 10 to 19, the number of suicides in this country have gone up for about 20 years. They've gone up. In 2019, they went down. Now that's pre-pandemic, they went down. The assumption was in 2020, you know, maybe they still went down for the first part of the year, but then everything ticked back up. That didn't happen. Nationally, statewide, the numbers went down. So it's hard because, of course, one suicide is too many suicides. We're here because of this. You know, it's difficult to look. The rates, to me, rates are important from a statistical perspective. Numbers are important to me because every number represents a life. And if we can change those kinds of things, it's great. So the numbers have actually gone down. My fear is that 2021, it's not going to go that way. And the reason why I would say that is that even if you go back to the Spanish flu back in the early 20th century, in the midst of the pandemic, numbers went down. It was afterwards that numbers started to really go up. I think one of the challenges that we run into is that, for lack of a better way of describing it, misery loves company to some degree. 40 million people lost jobs last year. Not 4, 40 million. Lots of people suffered some pretty significant changes in their lives. People lost loved ones to COVID, and a variety of other things were going on. It wasn't that you lost people, I lost people, we're all miserable together, but there is something to be said about we can get through difficult times together. As we come out of a pandemic, what happens is some people go back to where they were before, some people go beyond where they were before, and some people never move forward. And that is where some of these challenges, I think, really come into play. School is going to be an interesting thing this year. I'm still waiting to hear from my own school district as to what the plan is. We have heard nothing. I don't know if they're going hybrid. I think they're going hybrid. That makes it, you know, given what they did last year.
It's not Chester County, right?
No, I'm not in Chester County. Given what they did last year,
that.
the word Delta is enough for them to say we're going hybrid. But the point is that all of these trends and stuff like that, I think, are a reflection of kind of where we are societally and what's going on broadly around those kinds of things. Our ability to help kids reintegrate into classrooms. I don't know when you guys went back into the building last year. I assume you went back into the building at some point, right? You know, some of these kids have been out of a building for a year. My kids were home for a year. You know, so them going back to school is wonderful for them, but for some kids, you know, that's difficult. And how to help them get reconnected, how to help them do those kinds of things. So the rates and the numbers are going down, but the fear is how do we bring everybody back together in a sense that there's some sense of equity around how this is all happening and where everybody's going from that. I don't know if you have more data that you want to share.
Well, I used this analogy earlier today, and I think it's one that we're all painfully familiar with living through the pandemic, but we all watched as the numbers rose and fell throughout the pandemic of cases, and one of the things that we've been talking about on the task force, kind of with that knowledge in mind, because it's kind of a tenet of suicide prevention that we understand that based on some of the trends that we know about suicide, that they're often, we're in a dangerous time when things start improving, right? Even when people who are in treatment start to get better, sometimes that can be a dangerous time for them. And we saw it in the pandemic where cases started to increase, and then hospitalizations started to increase, and then deaths started to increase. But there was a period of kind of ramping up towards that, and that's been a fear that we've been talking about in the task force for the last year. And because we have so many connections on our task force into behavioral health providers, they've all kind of confirmed that as we've been going along, that while suicide rates are down, in spite of what the media likes to make a catastrophe, that people are going to die by suicide if we lock them down. That, in fact, didn't happen. But we have seen pretty dramatic increases in, talk lines and our local crisis centers getting calls. So we know that mental health concerns and crises are moving up, and we have some fears, and I think that everybody can recognize that when people go back to school, we're going to see more of that. I don't expect that we can draw a straight line to that equating to a higher suicide rate, at least I hope not, but I think it's that kind of data, and to the point that Matt made before about statistics are kind of only good longitudinally, right? Because we see pieces of the puzzle if we just look at 1 year or 2 years, but when we see trends, we see different things. So the lower number this year is a little bit scary, coupled with the increase in calls into mental health and crisis centers. We've been pretty lucky in our county. Actually, our numbers just in Chester County have been dropping over the last couple of years by 2, 3 a year. So we've been on a really good trend in our county, which does not necessarily reflect the country, but this year is a little bit scary.
Can I piggyback on one thing you said is we've all been under the same storm of COVID, but we all haven't been in the same boat. The boat is symbolic of your own resources or support systems or abilities to navigate your own coping mechanisms. So yes, we've all shared the same COVID kind of storm. We've all shared in the dilemma of it. But, you know, the line that I say a lot is, you know, COVID, you know, we were all sent to our own rooms to think about what we've done in the past, you know, 16 months or 18 months. But the truth is a lot of us didn't like what we found. And that's where you were talking about other people that didn't have resources or relied heavily on, like, say, going to the gym or the routine of going to work or the routines that were lost, not just the life losses and the stressors around job losses and everything else. I've got a client that I love to share the story. He gets up every morning, he gets in his car, he drives around the block, he comes back, and he goes to work, and then at 5 o'clock he gets back in his car, he drives around the block just to find that routine in the pandemic because he lost that sense of routine and that drive time to get out and change it up and do certain things and change clothes. And I literally wore dress pants and dress shirts the entire pandemic, even though most of my work was on Zoom, and I wanted to dress up like I showed up and suited up to live up to that. But that shared loss of things, yes, we've all been on the same storm, but we don't have the same boat, we don't have the same resources. That is going to play out more in the fall. That is going to play out. I'm a little bit nervous of how that's going to map out when kids or adults are having to deal with the stressors of getting back to the workplaces and the whiplash of the Delta variant and that kind of thing.
Thank you. And I think you managed to cover all 3 parts of that question in your responses.
Mike, going back to some of your roots professionally, could you speak a little bit about drug use and what role that plays in our kids' emotional health?
Just even speaking to that, on COVID times, one of the statistics I look is alcohol sales. With all the bars being closed, with all the classic venues that you would purchase alcohol in, the nightclubs, the sports venues, with all those venues being shut down, alcohol sales went up 15%. So where are people drinking? Alone or at home in front of your kids. So if your stress reliever is to have a drink at night in front of your family, in front of your kids, guess what your kids are picking up? I'm having a stressful day, so I'm going to drink to manage it. So when it comes to the impact of alcohol sales alone have gone up dramatically, I worry about how the shakeout of that happens and what happens in the fall time as kids and adults go back to work. So alcohol sales, the misinformation around cannabis, the legalization or medicalization of it, and again, the early exposure, the early onset of the exposure to cannabis to our youth, so many of our families don't know. There's not real science behind, you know, the medical marijuana industry and anxiety. There's no evidence that shows that it helps decrease anxiety. There's one research that shows it's similar to Zoloft for adults over the age of 24. But when it comes to age development piece, the cannabis use is off the charts in adolescence, and the minimization of it is so acute as well. So coupled with suicidality, coupled with, depression and mental health crisis that we're in, you know, kids are turning to use substances because they're accessible, so they're available. So as opposed to going to the gym or going to work out or having the routines or having outlets or community outlets, in this past year and a half brought to you by COVID, a lot of kids turn to using substances. So our substance use programs are getting filled and have waiting lists to get in as a result, because the substance use disorder is taken off, but that affects directly the depressant value of alcohol, the depressant value of cannabis, and how that affects decisional process making in adolescence is huge. So kind of like you were talking about suicidality and not being afraid to have the conversation, I say that same thing around substances and not being afraid to ask questions and talk to your kids about their substance exposure. And I'm not a prohibitionist, by the way. I'm not telling families and individuals to not drink if you don't have a problem, but I'm asking parents and families to think about their own consumption, their own expression, their own abilities to navigate that in front of your families, in front of your kids. And so you may want to look at your own exposure. The same thing goes to this thing as well. If you want to get a kid to get off their phone, you get off your own device. A lot of times families and parents are a bigger culprit than kids, but that's me. So that answered that question.
I think so.
Thank you. I'm going to skip down a little bit because I think there's some important questions, and we have a little under 15 minutes left. Could you, and this goes to Matt, Mike, and Sue specifically, but certainly everyone can jump in. How do you talk to your child who has lost a friend or a peer to death by suicide?
That's tricky. I mean, I think the key is to listen.
Yeah.
And to start by listening. Acknowledge that this is important to them. Acknowledge that it's a huge loss, you know, and being available for that conversation, to put yourself in a position to say, you know, they may not want to talk about it today, okay, but you go back and see if they want to talk about it another time, and always make yourself available to have that conversation. It's tricky because you know, again, we want to fix it. And everyone handles grief and loss differently. And expecting our kids to all fit into a pattern of this is how they're all going to do it, I think is a little bit misguided. And, you know, I think it just starts with being there for them, letting them know that, you know, you can't possibly appreciate the loss that they've had. Even if you've lost somebody yourself to suicide, like it's impossible to know how that one other person experienced the same loss. So, you know, recognizing and kind of putting that out there as, you know, understanding that this is challenging and difficult for them, but there's no way that I can possibly understand how you feel. As a therapist, I find myself oftentimes feeling like the key is to help me understand it from your experience. If I can get myself to the point where I'm understanding it the best I possibly can from how you're communicating to me, then the better. Can we do that as parents? Can we put ourselves in the spot to kind of set ourselves up that way? It's a difficult conversation to have. The point is, be there, be available, recognize that it may not be easy for them to talk about it. Don't force it upon them, but be there.
I don't know that I have anything to add to that. You did that lovely, I think. But I think the other part of it too is to be honest and not try to offer an explanation that might not exist.
Very important.
It's a very hard thing to understand. And again, as parents, you want to fix it and make it okay, and give it a name and put it away. And with suicide, you just can't do that.
I would add something that is related, but maybe not specifically answering that question. As a parent who lost a child, I was approached by several students that went to school with my son that in many cases weren't even particularly close friends of his, who shared with me their guilt, who came to me to say, I saw him by himself in the lunchroom, I saw him on the bus one day and I didn't speak to him, or I didn't return his call, or whatever. And what that really made me appreciate was exactly how these kids are impacted by this. And so I think that it's, however you find the way to talk to your kids, I think it's important to do that, because you might believe that your particular child maybe didn't know this student very well, and you may have asked, and they may have said, yeah, he was in a class of mine or whatever, but I didn't really know him. You might be surprised at the impact that they feel from that loss, whether or not they were even particularly close. Because I think the ripple effect is enormous, and we don't always see that.
And I to couple on that, we've been delivering QPR to kids in school, and just from what you said, empowering kids to know what the signs are, to know what the factors are, to know what to look out for, to know how to make a phone call to Safe to Say, or to your school counselor, or to your teacher, or to your mom. You know, we can look at data and examples of kids who have made phone calls or who have told an adult of their concerns, and there's been intervention. And it saves lives. So I think when kids suffer this loss, I don't want to say erase the guilt, because you can't really do that, but you can empower them to do things maybe a different way another time.
I think out of the interest of time, unfortunately, there are several questions that we probably haven't touched upon, but it seems like this is probably succinct in terms of what we're already talking about. How do we balance, and this is for any of the panelists, how do we balance the need of some students to move on and continue with some sense of normalcy, while others may need to grieve their loss? A Sue sighs.
Adolescent grief is not a straight line. Adolescent grief isn't a specific sync of 3 months later, 6 months later, you should or you can't feel like this. We don't want to put a timestamp on anything. So I think from the one perspective, not setting a timeline of this healing process for adolescents, I think as young adults and adolescents, they tend to grow through their process, and it's not a straight timeline. Grief comes up in a lot of different ways and a lot of different memories, so we can't kind of earmark it to a specific timeline. But I think, to somebody's point earlier, to have some sense of normalcy will help us heal. So I think what you guys did as a community and what I saw in the lacrosse team, for instance, or how I saw certain teams interacted or did certain events to kind of live and continue to strive, got that sense of like, we need to continue to grow though in our community. So there is a balance of being able to have that balance, have that conception of normal, of classes and sports and life to live for, to know that there's a better outcome out there. I don't know how to say it.
I have a hard time holding back on this conversation because it's a really tricky one. It's really hard. Kids come to school to learn. Kids come to school to get an education and to be supported and to be part of a school community. And we owe it to everybody in the community, in the school community, to make sure that their needs are addressed and met. We also owe it to do it in a way that makes sense, where we can identify kids who may have more specific needs, that we know that have suffered other kinds of losses that may be triggered by a loss of suicide. It's our job to have those connections, back to the connections, so we can start to identify those kids and pull them and make sure that they're supported, while also respecting the fact that other kids may have a different connection and a different need to get back to business as usual. And it's our job to help and sort out how to meet the needs of the whole student body. And it's a very tricky responsibility.
I sometimes have given talks, and depending on the audience, the very first slide after the title slide is sometimes one word, and that word is why. And the question is, how long does it take to answer a question that you can't answer?
Right.
for some people, they can come up like, I don't know, I'm never going to figure it out, but this is the way I understand it, and it takes however long for that to happen. For others, that question will plague them for the rest of their life because you don't have the answer. You're never going to have the answer, and it's so remarkably different than any other cause of death. You know, the irony, if you will, of the work that I do is I work at a hospital. You know, people come there for help to live, and I have people coming into my office saying, I want to die. The why question is just this thing that thankfully, you know, if they're coming into my office saying that, that's telling me we have some, we can do something. We're going to do something. But recognizing that it takes people a different amount of time to answer those kinds of questions is so important to, like, yeah, we want to move on to normalcy. Yes, we want to get back to routine. Yes, we want to do those kinds of things. Some people are going to be able to jump on there and sort of secondarily to that, they'll be battling this question. Others will be sitting in a classroom staring at the front of the classroom and thinking about the question instead of the content of the history lesson or whatever it happens to be that day. And it's just important to recognize not everybody's going to be in the same place.
It would be lovely if they were. You know, I've said for a long time that I think one of the most difficult parts of doing the work that we do in suicide prevention is exactly that there's no magic potion, there's no magic wand, and letting go of the why and understanding, and we teach this in suicide prevention classes, that suicide is probably the single most complex human behavior for us to understand when we're all, you know, born with nothing more than a will to survive all the time, and how someone can reject that is something we can never understand. In my personal experience, I find that it's not fruitful to try. And so I try to tell that to people as often as I can. It doesn't help me, it doesn't help you, and it doesn't help anybody else, unless there was some, you know, magical thought that provided a real cure, so to speak. But otherwise, it's not helpful. And it's a good thing for people to just, maybe it's helpful to some people to help accept, to move to the next step if they can accept that.
Thank you. I'm going to impose on you one last time because I do think we missed something that's very timely. And just ask you to quickly speak to, you know, what can we all do individually to help remove the stigma around suicide and being able to have those conversations and doing that in a responsible way that honors families who are experiencing loss, but also helps our students, our young people to openly address those issues as we've discussed all this evening.
I think what we're doing right now.
Talk about it.
More than anything else.
Great.
There was fear for years that if you came into a school and talked about suicide, that somebody was going to suddenly become suicidal because of this. And I always saw that as, first of all, the data doesn't support that at all. The second point, though, is that what it does is that person that came forward after that to their school counselor and said, I'm feeling suicidal or something like that, we created an opportunity for that to happen. Now, you don't do it in an auditorium like this because, you know, I have no idea how everybody's feeling right here. And, you know, can you imagine if it was a completely full auditorium? But opening up the conversation, talking about it.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists this evening. We are deeply appreciative for your time that you devoted to us, and thank you to everybody who came in person and everyone who's watching at home. And we appreciate everyone's effort as we continue to work together as a community to support not just our young people, but all of our adults in the community as well. So thank you again, and good evening.